All right, ladies and gentlemen, the bell means that it's time to get going for our last session. So if you can finish off your sentence down the back there and come to your seats, we'll all be grateful. This session is focused on energy improvements in the residential setting, a topic close to my heart from a research and a personal point of view. We have 4 presenters who are going to be giving an unusually cosmopolitan set of perspectives from Finland via Sussex, Leuven via Germany, and Tasmania, of course, deeply exotic, and finally from Özyeğin University in Turkey. So let me introduce the speakers as they each come forward. Martiskainen and her colleagues at Sussex have been doing great work on low energy housing transition in the United Kingdom and the role of intermediaries. So I'll pass over to her. We will use the same format that has been used for the other sessions today, in that we will save our questions up for we will have 5 minutes for each person, and then we will have a session at the end. Okay, all good? Mari, if I can invite you to take the stand.
Wow. Clap. No. No. I need to probably talk like this. So, right. So, thanks Barry for the introduction. I'm really delighted to be here. It's my first time in New Zealand, so I came on Friday to have a chance to have a look around your beautiful country. And this research, I'm presenting research which is ongoing, so I will give you some initial findings, and I'm doing this together with my colleague Paula Kivimov, and we are both, I'm actually going to go back to that in a minute, but I have to tell you a little bit about the Centre on Innovation and Energy Demand, because they very kindly paid for my ticket to come over, so I thank my employer for that. So we are based at Sussex University, but also we have researchers at Oxford and Manchester, and Debbie here is based at Oxford nowadays. So, and I am based at SPRU at Sussex, and we basically look at the emergence and diffusion and impact of radical low energy innovations. So funded for 5 years, and we are one of 6 energy demand centres in the UK. So there's a lot of money that has been going into energy demand, particularly demand research in the UK in the last few years. So, so just very quickly, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the UK's housing sector. So very kindly, Marcus and Lindsay gave a very, very good introduction already. So if there's some overlap, I apologise for that now. Introduce the term innovation intermediaries and what they could be in low energy housing. And I'll just very briefly show you one of our case studies and then some initial findings. So as you have already heard, the UK's housing stock is one of the worst in Europe, but actually now I'm starting to think it might not be one of the worst in the world, having heard about New Zealand, so sorry to say that, I've learned so much today, it's been brilliant. We have a very slow turn of buildings, new buildings, so it's very, people love their old homes, a lot of them were built in Victorian times. There's not much new build in the UK, and when there is, the kind of quality of it can be a bit questionable at times. There are about 27 million homes that are existing at the moment, and about 2/3 of those will still be standing in 2050. So there's a huge, huge challenge with the existing housing stock. And in terms of, if you look at the building sector in the UK, so there are multiple companies involved. It's a very fragmented sector. We have a lot of small to medium enterprises. We have a lot of sort of one-man van type businesses, so 1 or 2 guys just driving around in their cars, doing subcontracting for different people. So the sector is very uncoordinated. There's definitely, when it comes to energy efficiency or low energy housing, there's gaps in both skills and training, even though the sector does have a lot of trade associations and membership associations, but it tends to be that particularly for the kind of low energy solutions, there's gaps in skills particularly. And if you can see the photo there, that's quite typical. So the conditions can be really dire in some places. So for instance, you know, the building trade is very conservative, and they still do things in the same way that they've done for hundreds of years, and you know, they're not very kind of innovative in their practices. And I'll give you a very quick example. I went to see a house recently because I was kind of house hunting, and there was the estate agent showed me this like a Victorian property and said that, you know, this is brilliant, you could just renovate it and it would be fantastic. And it literally had mushrooms growing in the living room. And I thought, okay, I love foraging in my forest, yes, but not at home. And what tends to be with these sort of houses is then that people renovate them, but they only do the insides and they forget about the outsides. And then of course you're going to have a reoccurring problem of damp issues, for instance, if you don't do it properly. So that's kind of, you know, the methods that they use are not always that great. By the way, I'm kind of making a picture that can be quite bleak, but this is the maturity, but there are still, you know, good companies out there as well. And we've heard about a little bit about already the kind of hassle factor for energy efficiency measures from people. It's too expensive, people don't want to do it. At the moment, in terms of the sort of policy support for any kind of energy efficiency improvements in the UK, is just going down the drain. It doesn't exist anymore. A lot of the policy measures that have been in place have been taken away. We did another piece of research last year that looked at policy instruments that are actually aimed at energy efficiency in buildings, and there are about 38 different instruments that somehow link to it, but none of them are really kind of any more directly aided to, or kind of, excuse me, I just did something with that, to kind of address to the public to say that, okay, can you go now and do this? Because we had the Green Deal, I don't know if you've heard about that, which was basically giving out loans to people to do measures, and that doesn't exist anymore. Last year, the government decided that they had like for 10 years, they had a target that from 2016 onwards, all new homes should be zero carbon. Last year, they decided to remove that. So a lot of the policies they've actually removed and they've gone backwards on. So we are in a situation where it's, you know, policy support and regulation doesn't necessarily require you to do that. Okay, building regulations are there, but they are not always necessarily enforced very well. So what we are interested in our research is that we think that, okay, the UK has really ambitious climate change targets still, that we need to reduce 80% of our emissions by 2050. And up until about 2 weeks ago, we still had very, very ambitious EU targets as well, but now no one really knows what's going to happen to those. So we need more of a kind of systemic and architectural innovation in the sector, and that means integration of multiple technologies, integrated design, and also collaboration between different actors. So we're not just looking at insulating one wall, we're looking at a mixture of measures in both new build and retrofits. So this is where we think that intermediary organizations could be crucial. And I'm not going to read out the quote because it'll take too much time. But innovation intermediaries are usually the facilitators of innovation processes that are neither the kind of inventors or the end users, so they are kind of the people in between. So they help people to create relationships, they help in terms of seeking funding, creating networks, so, you know, putting the kind of right type of people together. And they usually, often they are kind of neutral organizations, even though some of them can take quite active roles as well, and I'll talk to you about that a little bit later. So in this research, we're particularly interested in terms of, in the UK context, that, you know, who are the intermediaries that could potentially be involved in the low energy housing sector, but also we are interested in what type of processes are they actually supporting or getting involved in. So previous research has looked at intermediaries in the context of low energy housing, and in the UK we have done a kind of like a mapping exercise, and we identified about somewhere between 80 to 90 organizations that could kind of fit into this sort of intermediary role, and it's very, very varied. It could include things like organizations like government organizations, local authorities, member and trade organizations, business organizations, various charities, and the role of these organizations can be different in different types of projects or different types of programs, for instance. So it's really it's a sector, well, if you look at the kind of intermediary, it could be that in one project there's one type of actor and in another project it's another type of actor, so it's very, very varied. So what we are doing in our research, we are doing case study-based research, so in-depth case studies of 6 housing projects in Brighton. And we chose Brighton because this is kind of almost like an excuse for anyone who's talking about Manchester and Cardiff and all the other UK cities. Brighton is kind of, we think that it's a little bit of a hot spot for low energy housing, particularly because it has a very, very supportive local authority, and that tends to be the case that, you know, if you have a local authority that is supporting these sort of developments, it's really, really good. And we also think that Brighton has this kind of protective space. For those of you who are familiar with niche literature, so it's kind of almost like this kind of green milieu. There's a lot of green-minded people living in Brighton. We have the only green MP in the UK. There's this annual event called Eco Open Houses event, which showcases to people that you can actually go and see somebody's home who's, you know, someone who's built an energy-efficient home, new home, or retrofitted an existing home, and you can go and snoop around their house and ask questions and how they did it and find out which contractors they used. So we think that in Brighton particularly, it's interesting to look at these case studies and just look at that, you know, what type of intermediary organizations might be involved. So we, like I said, we're doing 6 cases, both new build and retrofits, and we've done document analysis and literature analysis and semi-structured interviews with key actors. And we're actually also writing case histories of each case, tracing the innovation process and seeing, you know, what is the role of intermediation. And with the case histories, we are writing them and then sending them back to the interviewees so that they can check them all and just make sure that, you know, we got it all right. So we're doing it that way. So I'm going to talk to you about one of our cases, which is called One Brighton, and it's a new development in the centre of Brighton near the railway station, and it was built on a site which was basically derelict for about 40 years. And this is part of one sort of bigger regeneration area of this, regeneration of this area. And there was a lot of debate about this, and this actually links to some of the previous presentations as well about civil society action, because there was a lot of debate about developing this area, because the initial plan was just for a supermarket and a car park. And of course, everyone in Brighton went like, well, we don't want another supermarket, or we don't want another car park. So there was a lot of resistance to that, and as a result, lots of people started to kind of think that, well, actually, we want something slightly different. So they contacted a developer called Bioregional. Some of you might have heard of them because they've done lots of projects worldwide. And Bioregional came in at the kind of master planning stage of this site, and they suggested that, well, we could do something more. Let's do community engagement around this and find out a little bit more about what we could do. So as a result of that, Brighton and Hove City Council actually, they started to then think that, well, we could actually do a little bit more than just build a supermarket. So there's actually houses, and there's flats, and there's different kind of developments. And One Brighton is one block in that site. And so it has 172 flats, 54 of those are affordable homes. It has very, very high energy efficiency sort of features, solar PVs, and actually the first really large-scale residential biomass boiler in the UK, which they've had a lot of problems with, but they replaced it this year, so it's kind of, they've had a lot of learning in that time that they've done this. It's a car-free development, which is really, really key. And for all of those who do mobility research here, you know that a lot of the time car emissions are the ones that are actually the really high ones. So one of the reasons why this development is pretty much almost zero carbon is because it doesn't have cars, it's car-free development, apart from disabled spaces. There's rooftop allotments for people who live in the flats, and this is something that came from the community engagement, for instance, that people said that, well, we want opportunities for food growing, so there's rooftop allotments for that. And on the ground floor of one of the blocks, there's community space, so it's basically community organizations can go and rent space there. And one of the things that actually happened during this was that the recession hit, so a lot of the community organizations that were going to come in actually then couldn't come, or they completely vanished, and their funding stopped. So, but now, after 6 years of having been completed, so this was built in 2007 to 2010, it's pretty much full now. So they had issues. So in the I hope you can see this. Can you see that okay, roughly? Well, it just gives you an idea of, so basically what we've done is we've looked at the role of intermediaries in all different stages of this particular project, and we're doing for every single project that we are looking at. So looking at the planning stage, looking at the construction stage, looking at the post-construction stage, and then also the kind of more embedding and upscaling stage. So for instance, with the One Brighton case, we identified that at the planning stage, there was a guy who was working as a sustainability consultant, almost became like an accidental intermediary for the project, but because he just happened to share an office with someone from Brighton and Hove City Council. And they basically said that, well, we have this new development, it's got to have all these sustainability features, but we're not quite sure how to do it. And he said that, well, hang on a minute, I know all about sustainability and community engagement, I can help you. So he ended up doing a lot of the community engagement for this particular development in Brighton. So he did group discussions and exhibitions and all sorts of things. And then he also actually, he didn't just do the development, but the community engagement, but he actually ended up being involved also throughout the construction and also throughout the post-construction stage, because he was, for instance, during the construction stage, he was talking about the projects to construction industry and saying that, look, we are doing things really differently here, because for the Brighton, one thing I forgot to say earlier was that the One Brighton, it was developed on the principles of One Planet Living, and I don't know if are you familiar with that principle, One Planet Living? No one's saying anything, yes or no. So basically it's 10 different principles that involves things like energy and waste and lifestyles, food, the whole everything. And the construction for this project was literally following those principles. So for instance, they had an organic cafe on the side, and so he was highlighting all these sort of other sustainability measures that you don't often get in other construction projects necessarily. And then we also identified that the main developer was, okay, they were developers of the project, but they also had a very kind of blurry relationship, because they developed something called One Planet Living communities, and they are taking this learning from here to other organizations as well. I already mentioned the Eco Open Houses event, so One Brighton has actually been part of that. So Eco Open Houses is one kind of intermediary that we have identified in this project. And also Brighton and Hove City Council, not necessarily so much in the actual construction or the post-construction stage, but in the embedding and upscaling stage, because they are now saying that, okay, we managed to do this in Brighton, hence everyone else can do this as well. So they are now showcasing this development as one for other developers that, you know, if they can achieve it, you can do it as well. So this is my last slide, okay, very quickly. So initial findings are that intermediary roles can change during the course of these sort of projects. So I've already mentioned the sustainability consultant in One Brighton case, and the boundaries of intermediation can be quite fluid. So we have to really look at more in our data once we have all of our case studies finalized, and just, you know, look at that, you know, where do the boundaries actually lie, that when does an intermediary become more of an active organization or actively engaged organization. And I mentioned that you know, financial crash influenced it a lot. So this sort of, for anyone who's familiar with the multi-level perspective, so we have regimes and landscapes. So if there are any kind of, well, we've talked about externalities in other presentations here. So if there are any kind of outside shocks, all of these processes can get influenced by those. So for instance, financial crash in the UK affected how many people were able to move into the community space in the One Brighton development. So we think that to get this kind of systemic innovation that you need in terms of for the to kind of well improve the UK's housing stock, that, you know, you need effective intermediation, but we still quite don't know, you know, how you would actually measure what kind of intermediary is effective, and but we do know that they will actually be able to be more effective if they have practical learning and experience, that if they've actually been involved in something, rather than just being on the fence, kind of looking down and thinking, okay, that's a good thing. But actually, if they're fully involved, it's much likely to be better for all of them. So, and I finished there. Sorry to go over a little bit of time. Shall I buy you a bottle of wine? So, thank you.
Let me introduce our next speaker. Phillipa Watson from University of Tasmania, speaking on behalf of herself and Millie Rooney and Michelle Gabriel. Her subject related, getting bill smart, outcomes of an energy efficiency project for low-income householders in Tasmania. Welcome, Phillipa, and we look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you. How's that now? Is that coming up? Okay, I'll just try one more time. Okay, I'll use the hand one. Oh, there, it's coming up now. No. Use the hand one. Hopefully nothing falls off. Yes, okay. All right. Hello. So I would like to speak about Getting Bill Smart, our project that we ran. I'd just like to basically run very quickly through the outcomes from that project. I've come over because I really want to engage with New Zealanders. You're doing some fantastic work over here in this area. And so I'm looking forward to having conversations with you. So I'm presenting, but I worked with an amazing group of collaborating researchers. Dr. Michelle Gabriel was our chief investigator, but she left and I became the chief investigator, but we'd worked from the start together on this. Millie Rooney was our community and sharing specialist. We had Steve Watson working on the temperature and humidity, and Anton Vikstrom, our project manager, also did some research. So like in New Zealand, we have a really big problem with our housing stock. It's letting us down, and in quite a few ways, but today I'm really focusing on the thermal performance and the energy performance and how it's letting us down like that. We also in Tasmania regularly have lower socioeconomic average indicators than the rest of Australia. I'm not talking about compared to Aboriginal Australia, of course, in Central Australia, but I am talking about state averages. Low-income householders live in poor quality housing, and what that of course means, similar to here, is what we've been hearing. They're thermally poor equals more energy use if they can afford it, costs money equals stress. We had one participant say it is like living in a field, and there was just no room to make change in these cold homes, especially with a difficult landlord and a low income. So in this barrier-ridden space, we did have the government realise this was a problem, thank goodness, but they'd already had a few hiccups with some other programs, that's an understatement. So they grasped the difficulty, but they were a bit scared about working with low-income householders. So they said to us, how is this best to approach this? We'll give you 3-year programs, suggest novel approaches. They came up with this low-income energy efficiency program, which funded 20 projects around Australia, and Get Bill Smart was one of those. And each one was testing something novel or new for the Australian landscape in energy efficiency. The consortia that got together for this project in Tasmania was Sustainable Living Tasmania as the project manager and the applier of all support activities. Mission Australia led the project. They're like a housing organisation, housing support and also social welfare organisation. And at University of Tasmania, we did the research. The aims for Get Bill Smart were multiple, which is always a problem when you've got a research program. But we were looking at, yes, reducing energy, but we also were trying to really look at the mix of thermal comfort in there as a physiological need. And also, so we wanted to particularly understand the effect of interventions that we ran. But we were also just looking at energy efficiency more generally, but we were also providing employment and training for a lot of people. Now, the thing we also wanted to do is look at this take back the trade-off conversation. Everyone says it around the world. What exactly were people trading their energy off for? We had 2 approaches that we used. We went for a direct approach, which was our tried and true method. We were comparing against this. It's really common in Australia. People go into homes, they do education and upgrades, and then they sort of leave the home. So it's a one-off by a specialist home energy helper or 2 home energy helpers. Someone may come back to put curtains in or something like that, but generally they get little upgrades done while they're there and then they leave. We trialled that against a community capacity building approach, which had a community engagement officer, but also had energy champions, which were local people who came onto the program and were trained. We selected one area that was known to be very disadvantaged in Greater Hobart, and they ran community events and activities, and actually a lot of one-on-one community events as well in homes. Actually, what you see here are some door snakes that were made at a local festival in the community, and at that same community we ran the Price is Right game. The Power Rangers, the community energy champions decided to call themselves Power Rangers. They got to name up what they were, and those are little cartoons of each person. Sorry, I've gone back. So it was about community capacity building, was testing whether if we shared knowledge, could we strengthen the capacity of the community through these kind of activities. And we were really, really looking forward to using the expertise of the local champions. Method-wise, we went for a multi-method approach. We were dealing with a real project. We couldn't isolate things as well as you'd like to for a research approach. So we actually went for a bulk study and a detailed study, and I advocate this at all times whenever possible with funding. We went for the trend analysis in the bulk of the 500 participants that were involved in the study, and we went and got billing data off them, and we did surveys with them. We also went and did a detailed study, which was incredibly long-winded and in-depth, and we, along with the information we collected for the bulk study, we collected house condition observations, temperature and humidity, and energy use, and we did resident interviews longitudinally. So the timeline was, it was a before-after kind of project, so the timeline was around the support activities, and we measured for the main part of the study, we measured winter of 2014 and against winter 2015 to get some outcomes. We also trained in December 13, around then we trained up the energy champions. So I just want to go through some of the key findings from our study, and these are the points I'll just be mentioning them in a minute anyway. So the types of energy and comfort changes that households achieved, we were expecting to get some outcome with a direct home approach or the home energy helper, home visit approach. That one worked. Capacity building by itself, on the measures we took and could take, realistically in this project, we didn't see it work. But home visit plus community capacity building as a mix worked the best. So this was really quite a relief, because we did see a lot of benefit in the community capacity building as we went through, and it was a relief to see it come out in the figures at the end. And overall, we had around 65% of households decrease their energy use between 2013 and 2015. We had home upgrade visits get a 1.4 kilowatt hour average per day average energy saving. On payback without much health data, we got a 10.3 year payback. But when that was combined with the capacity building, we saw an increase in energy saving to 2.8 kilowatt hours per day, and we also saw a 9.7 year payback. So we saw it really change the figures. And also we did see comfort zones, an improvement in comfort zone time, but this is a much more complicated story. So we do deal with that in our report. I don't really have a lot of time to go into that right now, but to say that yes, we saw improvements, but I would like to qualify those by saying go and read the report, please. Our understanding of households did improve. In Tasmania, we had very little data to use. I was a bit jealous of New Zealand's database. You have some great studies done. So now we have some data on how poor the stock is, our building stock. We've got data on energy use, comfort. We also learnt a lot about the nuance of everyday life for these householders. And we talked to them about their confidence around energy efficiency and comfort, and their community connections, and also how all this affected their well-being. So it was great to see that. There were so many different influences. When we went into the detailed study, we saw so many different influences working on these households. And the in-depth study provided us with the opportunity to talk about some of those, although it's hard to get through them all. This is just an example from the in-depth detailed study that we did, just talking about how we were trying to really capture multiple outcomes, and some where we achieved success and some we didn't, and it varied house to house. And this example is just showing just one of the things we had in each case. So we did a case for each household that was many pages long. And I'd just like to draw attention in this one that we do talk about thermal comfort zones, and we also do talk about housing heating efficiency. We worked out a little number for that. So in terms of the trade-offs, we saw a lot of trade-offs being made, not just between energy and comfort, although that was a critical one, but of course there's energy cost, comfort, health, and they all seem to mix clearly in with each other. We had mould and damp versus drying out the house was a significant one, and I suspect it's quite similar for New Zealand houses. We had micropolitics in the home, including pets. They were quite an enjoyable kind of extra challenge in the house and wonderful thing at the same time for households. Even tropical fish were an energy efficiency issue. We had many others, as you can see. Ownership and renting, the tenure was an amazingly important one. But also community networks and connections came in and influenced how people acted. Interestingly, we were seeing that if households did save energy, they did use it for other needs generally. I can pretty confidently say that now, that, yeah, I'm not even going to pretend that we're going to save energy often in these situations. We're looking for well-being increases and lifestyle improvements. And one other interesting practice that we noted was that if householders had a comparatively higher energy use before in the group, they had a comparatively higher energy use after as well. But I'd like to qualify that by saying low-income households generally don't have as higher energy use as the average anyway. But that was a really interesting one, and I'd like to progress investigation into that one in terms of practices. So the energy versus comfort was a really critical one for our study. But with the houses in Tasmania not holding heat well, there was a couple of interesting things coming off with trade-offs. So many houses, we saw heater use, energy use having to increase comfort. And we also saw people who saved heating energy also had to reduce comfort at the same time. So these little fuel gauges are meant to sort of show the two different relationships. So the one on the top left showing you when someone increased their energy, they might get more comfort. So it's fairly simple, but it's really making the point that to make shifts, householders had to use energy or go cold. But also, what we also saw, sadly, was a lot of houses that were heated to improve energy, improve comfort, just did not improve comfort. So we were having houses that were just far too cold, that would just basically, once they got to a certain level, any more heater use put into them just got sucked out into the cold night air and didn't help them at all. So we also, we've had people talking about this today, but we had heat pumps coming out much better. If you look at this table in terms of the comfort zone we used, which was an 18 to 24 degrees comfort zone for this particular study, we're encouraging discussion about that in Australia at the moment to see if we can shake up what really is a comfort zone for different localities. But the houses were grouped, when we grouped them by heating type, we really did see that heat pumps came out with the best air temperatures. So I could do some more data analysis on that against some of the interviews and discussions and see if that's coming out as actual subjective thermal comfort as well. The heating thresholds were affecting health and mobility, and householders were saying it directly, as we've just heard. I just rug him up and I put the heaters on, but then I might also need the asthma pump. I mean, maybe you could heat up less if he wasn't sick, possibly. And they're just sort of trying to make a decision about so many things at once, including medication. So overall, we found that future programs can mix in-home energy upgrade visits, those one-on-one fast knowledge, experts going into homes with community capacity building activities. We'd suggest modifying the ones we tried. One of the things we actually noted was that the community capacity that the activities we were trying were very, very new. So they were actually quite novel. And we couldn't actually find many programs around the world to base our first design on, and we were going with the tacit knowledge of our Sustainable Living Tasmania and what they knew about it. It was very new compared to the in-home upgrades, so we weren't going to see. We were looking at something that was evolved against something that was newly evolving. So we would like to see that evolve in any new programs. Champions gave the project something it otherwise wouldn't have had in the community. They brought important understanding of the community to the project design, and important language decisions were made according to their advice. And they gave us a lot of understanding about the community that actually hadn't actually been sort of tabled anywhere. But the housing is such poor quality, it's making change difficult. So we can only achieve certain thresholds of change at the moment, working on the small budgets for upgrades that we've had so far. And where we're consistently measuring low indoor temperatures, even lower than we just saw with the youth study. Internally in bedrooms, the averages were concerningly low. So overall, I'm sort of still very concerned about the building stock, and we have a long way to go. So the government is actually currently reviewing all the 20 projects that went through the low income energy efficiency program, as Get Bill Smart did. And all projects have underlined that we do need organisational support in these instances, in these low income circumstances, to encourage energy related change in the communities, in houses. And it won't happen spontaneously or with unsupported volunteers in the community, which the government would like to see. And so that was very clear from all the communities working on these projects around Australia. We've actually started a group of energy efficiency researchers from these projects, and we're currently trying to work out what else we're allowed to analyse from our data and how we can collaborate and push forward and critique each other's methods, which I'm very excited about. Our thermal comfort measures and our energy measures, we're just actually talking to the other groups to critique those. We just had a session. The group of energy efficiency researchers has become formalised and is being supported by the government, so we're starting with a conference in February next year at the University of Wollongong, so I'll be looking forward to sending out an invitation because I would love to keep the conversation going with all of you in New Zealand with your wonderful work. And we are going to continue to advocate for improvements, including ensuring that thermal performance of existing houses is included in energy efficiency to ensure that thermal comfort is on the agenda and health is on the agenda. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Phillipa. A lot of really interesting things and some quite extraordinary comparisons to make with New Zealand there. It's great to see them. At this point, I'll ask all members of the panel to come forward and face the questions that I'm sure people have been thinking over for the last few minutes. So, questions from the audience.
I have a very simple question about this car-free building in Brighton. And I wonder, is it so that people don't use cars, or are they not allowed to own cars?
People are still allowed to own cars. I mean, we live in a very kind of open society. In the UK, you can pretty much do what you want. But it is, there are actually people living in the building who have got rid of their cars as a result of moving in there. So, and it was actually one of the quite problematic issues for the planning application, because some of the planning team and some of the councillors were, particularly the Conservative Party councillors in Brighton, were against it, and they were saying that, you know, we can't have a car-free development, that's ridiculous. But luckily Brighton at the time had a Green Council, so they approved it. So, and it's been one of the learnings actually from, for Bioregional, the developer. They did BEDSET in 2002, which is Beddington Zero Carbon Development in London. And they actually found out that the biggest savings that they had in that development was for people not to have cars. So they encourage car clubs, and they encourage, I mean, the actual building is bang on city centre Brighton. There's Brighton railway station next to it, and there's a really good public transport links. So they try and encourage people to use public transport instead. But yes, you can own cars, but a lot of people have actually got rid of their cars as well.
Yeah, hi, John Williams from Otago University. So I've got a question for Phillipa and Kimberly, and also Lindsay and Fatima. A common theme running around poverty is, I want to also, echo something Ben Walliscroft said. What's needed, you know, fuel poverty is highly correlated with poverty in general. And if you want to tackle these problems, a whole person or a whole system approach is really needed, and not looking at things, not you know, insulating houses and installing heat pumps. You know, that's part of the solution, but there's more to it than that. A common theme running through some of what the respondents were saying is the government should do something. And when I hear that, I always think, which government? The government you voted for, or the government you didn't vote for? And one thing we know is that disadvantaged people are politically disengaged, and youth are politically disengaged as well. And you can see this with what happened in the Brexit vote, right? People wanting a recount. So I'm wondering if there's any thought being given to getting people more politically motivated and engaged in the disadvantaged groups.
I had an answer for the first part of your comment about, I wanted to just mention that one of the other projects, quite a few of the other projects that were part of LEAP, so around Australia, they came to the table when we would meet, and they said, point blank, they need more than energy efficiency. We go in there with that as a device, and we actually, the first visit's generally us sorting out other things for them. And this was in an Aboriginal community in remote Victoria, so in the state of Victoria. And they just said, no, we deal with the other stuff first, then we come back and do energy efficiency. So that was the comment about there are so many other things, and yes, we recognise that. But also energy efficiency is a hook the government will work with. So I often work with it because of that. That was the first part.
Just on governments and who gets to vote for the government, the children that I've been working with are 14 and 15 years old, so they're not even there yet. So when you're looking at it from an energy vulnerabilities perspective, or you're taking a Rawlsian approach, you know, they're not even there. They don't get a say. They want to have a say, but they're not even at that stage.
Just a very quick comment on that. I was really loved hearing the other presentations, because one piece of work that I've been doing recently is looking at community action on fuel poverty in the UK context, and we studied energy cafes, or kind of these energy shops that are kind of pop-up shops or cafes where people can go and find out information about energy bills, and the kind of they start with the notion that, you know, let's talk about your energy consumption, let's talk about your energy bills over a cup of tea and a cake. But what we found actually in that research is that those sort of initiatives are really good at linking different authorities, because a lot of the times, I mean, what we found in the UK now is that the energy efficiency angle doesn't necessarily work anymore that much, that we have to start talking about comfort, and we have to start talking about particularly health, because in in England actually, so not including Scotland and Wales, but in England, the fuel poverty and the kind of associated illnesses and health hazard, they cost about 1.3 billion each year for the NHS, which is a huge amount of money. So we are now thinking that we should frame it more as a health and comfort issue rather than just energy efficiency issue. And the work that I've been doing with community groups has been fascinating in that, because there's also an issue of, you know, how do you identify the people that most need help, and the 10% indicator is not necessarily always the best one to do that.
Just on the political point, I'd like to probably say that a lot of people aren't even in a situation to have thought about energy, particularly when we get there to begin with. We often find that the conversation at the start is a lot of questions dropping over cliffs but the next time people are much more engaged. So once they've had the experience, they're more prepared to discuss what it means, and once they've had time to actually and spent a bit of, prioritised a bit of thinking, then it becomes a whole new conversation. So I'd suggest that at the end of the longitudinal interviews is the time when I think people are starting to go, hey, this is important, or hey, I see the relevance politically as well.
Maybe could I also just add that when I asked the children that I was working with, which parts of the research do you want to be involved with? Is it you want to come up with the questions, you want to do the analysis, you want to do the presentation? They said, we want to do all of it. And when we present, we want John Key to be there. And if John Key can't be there, then we want John Key's man to be there. We had policymakers at that presentation. They were interested. I'm not sure if it's gone anywhere much further since then, but it's kind of a two-way conversation, and the kids are interested in being in that conversation.
Kia ora, thank you so much for your presentations. They were really stimulating. And Phillipa, just a quick comment. We actually, Michelle and Becky mainly, and some other team members did a very similar exercise to yours, looking at actually at community engagement at a community level versus individual home performance. And so there's a paper come out actually about comparing those two, but we actually didn't do what you did, which was actually try both together, but that was one of the recommendations of the paper, so we'd be keen to talk about that. So that's more a comment than a question. Yes, but very exciting. But what I wanted to say was I suppose through all of this, one thing that I guess we think about is emerging energy literacy at a community level is actually a form of empowerment that can then catapult people into other conversations. And I just wondered whether you had a comment about that, any of you.
Absolutely, we saw that. We saw when we first went to householders, and this is kind of making a stereotype because not everyone was the same, of course, but just to say it quickly, we saw no language around energy when we went in. And when we went back, there was language, there was awareness. So, because we actually spoke to them at least 3 times, but we're face-to-face at least twice, but more so 4 or 5 times. We spoke to them maybe 6, depending on how many appointments we had to make and things. But yeah, the energy literacy really changed, and they owned it in their own words. But at the beginning, they weren't even engaging in that area. So I absolutely, we saw that, and I thought that was a wonderful gift to be able to watch that. I was more excited about it because I haven't done a lot of community work as much as I've done more individual household thinking and decision making. But Millie just sort of rolled her eyes at me a few times and said, yeah, yeah, she got it. But yes, I'd love to read your work on that if it's published. That'd be great.
Hi, Steve Rotman from the IAA DSM Task on Behaviour Change. What really strikes me seeing that this is such a massive horror story in so many different countries and so many different climate zones, etc., is that, and Barry, you may need to help with that, because it seems to be like more of a political, legal issue, almost in the sense that this is not a technical issue and this is not so much a community or behavior issue. What this issue is that we really need access to a level of warmth and cheap energy, a minimum level of warmth, like a minimum wage, that needs to be embedded as a human right. I mean, if we're talking about embedding access to Google as a human right, I think, industry gets very cheap energy in most of these countries where we have massive fuel poverty, and then they get tax breaks on top of it. And it's like, can we start ramping this up to a more of an international human rights issue, really? Barry? You?
Thanks. I have one comment on that, because in the UK there has been actually quite a big lobby to make energy efficiency as an infrastructure issue. And I think a lot of the people, like leading fuel poverty researchers in the UK, agree, which actually this links to also the work that we are doing, is that the best thing would be to just demolish the worst homes and rebuild, because in some cases, even with the retrofit, you can't achieve the level of comfort that you need, and it's going to be way too expensive. But then what do you do with the kind of values and norms of people wanting to live in Victorian homes which have period features and fireplaces, and so you can't necessarily tackle that with always with energy efficiency.
Seeing as you're putting me on the spot there, see, you can talk, well, definitely a right to housing is regarded as a secondary or tertiary type of human right, which is well entrenched, and that has to be a right to a reasonable type of housing. Others, Adrian Bradbrook, for example, has espoused rights of access to energy, which I think we would fold around an idea of energy services and at an acceptable price. As part of that, the politics of it is, I think, in a time when things are intensely poll-driven and focus group driven, that if it is an issue, but it's not actually affecting the numbers, then it won't have much of an impact. But we do see situations where the New Zealand Herald, for example, has made quite a substantial campaign and has raised the profile of some of these issues substantially. Not leading to immediate results, but one can be hopeful for them in the longer term. Molly.
Very interesting that not long after he was elected for the first time, John Key addressed a Grey Power annual meeting and gave a long speech outlining all of his economic aspirations and his growth and employment and this and that. And somebody asked him, well, interesting that you've actually started a program which we appreciate more than anything else, which is the Warm Up New Zealand program. Now, how did that fit in with you? Oh, he said, we did that because the taxpayers love it. We basically did that for votes. And I'd love you to tell your students in Levin that John Key did approach grey power and said, yep, we did it for votes. Of course, it hasn't lasted that long, and there's still only maybe a third of the houses that should be insulated are. Now, see, what did you say? I wanted to respond, oh, human right. It wasn't too long after that no, in fact, it was quite a few years later, that grey power actually did a submission to the UN Human Rights Treaty negotiation. It was in about 2012, I think, maybe later. And we put particularly that we felt that adequate warmth in houses was a human right. And we went through a whole lot of legalistic stuff, including, Ian, some of your work. Thank you. But we haven't seen much action.
I was just call to arms. World Health Organization has established figures that we've been using for a very long time, but they're quite static, really, when you think about the contexts of different countries and their climates. Those were translated into energy engineering standards for air conditioning, and they still stand. I mean, over 15, 20 years ago, we were trying to fight for more variability in air conditioning levels, and we really haven't made much room in 30 years. We haven't made many steps forward with thermal comfort in housing. So call to arms, let's go to World Health Organization and start to engage again.
Hi, I just have a quick comment, really. But first, thank you. I really enjoyed all the presentations. I just feel that this notion of health and quality of life and well-being is kind of interwoven amongst a number of the presentations, Phillipa and Kimberly in particular. And I suppose I just want to say that this whole notion of health and quality of life has a lot of cultural salience for many people. And perhaps if messages and policy designed perhaps around health as a health message, as you discussed, more so than maybe energy efficiency, would have more successful rates for interventions. And I suppose it's really just a comment, but the notion of health really is a huge factor that I think has a lot of relevance for people, more so than maybe messages of energy efficiency.
Recognizing the benefits that energy efficiency interventions have on health. So I think there's been an internal shift in recognizing the value of that. You have to discuss it with the budget ministers.
I'll just add a comment there that a lot of the drivers for doing some of the things about poverty as a whole have come from financial management and from Treasury. There's a growing recognition that these things can be described as wicked problems, not only in a moral sense, but also just in how many complicated parts they have to them. So we in the energy area have to recognize that we are dealing with one part of a large thing. And as I think it was you, Pip, who said, we can't be expected to go in there and do something and work some sort of miracle when it is a whole lot more complicated than that, and the what's underlying it is much more difficult. If you get the physical circumstances right, then you will still have the behavioural thing, which fits in really quite well with the overall energy culture concept.
Hi, I was really interested about the comfort zone concept, which sort of popped up amongst all of your talks. And I wondered, Phillipa, your comment about sparking conversations in different localities, I'm interested in how we actually go about that, sparking those conversations about, this comfort zone that people have, because obviously it's different, particularly in different climate zones as well. And I just wondered if you could talk more about that, because I'm just quite interested in how it happens, and it also speaks to that sort of energy literacy aspect as well.
We see comfort zone as being the link to health in terms of our conversation, in terms of the thermal comfort. We think it's a great connection. I have a background in some architecture, and so some passive design and architectural science. So what we've begun to do in Australia is we've got the Darwin project, the Wollongong project, Adelaide, Sydney, Queensland, unfortunately nothing from Perth, and we are actually critiquing each other's methods right now and talking about what we used as thermal comfort. Do we think that's reasonable? What did we actually see in terms of performance of the houses, which was often quite different? So we're actually getting together and collaborating right now to critique and assess what to do next. And how we started that was we just said, right, okay, so here's what we did. So we've put our full method in to our report, which is online. And I'd invite anyone who wants to join us in this critique and conversation. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to at least get some academic work done on it, and we'll start lobbying the government with as soon as we've got some comparisons to take up, which shouldn't be too long because we've already got the data.
Can I just say I'm a little bit cautious about talking about comfort if we're not also taking into account what is actually healthy and what is going to maintain and promote population health. If we start saying we're comfortable with 16 degrees for long periods of time, what's that going to do to our respiratory health? The reason that the WHO has the 18 to 21 degree standard is because that is what, for most people, will keep them healthy. For 21, the 22, 3, 4 degrees is for if you're older or for infirm or disabled people. But, you know, we really need to be careful when we're talking about what comfort means across different disciplines, I think. And I'd be very cautious about, you know, suddenly changing this to say that we can cope and be comfortable at lower temperatures or at very high temperatures without thinking through the health implications of that.
Just one.
I'm just going to exercise the chairperson prerogative and ask a question of my own. Ebru, these questions of energy poverty or fuel poverty, how do they work out in Turkey?
Well, yeah, you know, the energy and the politics go together. This is the same in Turkey too. There are households that the babies die because of fuel poverty, because it's too cold and they can't have warm. And the government give coal to people that cannot warm their houses. So, and there is use of natural gas in big cities, but it's not the case in rural of Turkey. So we see the food poverty, but this is very politics in Turkey because the government wants to plant nuclear powers because of food poverty, and you know, this is when thinking about the ecology and environment, the people are against this. So sometimes when looking at from the academician side, it's hard because you know, you do the research and all the things, but you need the power to affect the government. So because it's important protesting, I think, because former presentations we had we saw the power of the protesting. So I think it's important to affect the government. Actually, we have the sun in Turkey. We can use the sun power, and it's increasing using sun power. And we have wind in Turkey. It's usable, and we can use it. But you know, because of the politics, rather than using the sun or the wind, other power fuels are trying to use, like coal, and we know that is not good for the environment. So it's experienced. We do have full poverty in rural and in cities, but it can be increased. But it depends on the government, and and the negotiation between the people and the government.
Just an observation or a comment. I'm from Ipsos. We've been doing ECA's research for the last 7 years. And so it's surprising for people to hear about how energy efficiency needs to be positioned in relation to health and warmth and comfort when, since ECA went above the line with energy-wise, those messages have always been a core message that they've put into the marketplace about how insulation improves your health, improves your warmth and comfort and so forth. So it's not really a new idea as such, because ECA's been doing it for the last 7 years. So why is it sort of such a new thing to hear now?
It's not, but the government in Australia, we're not using the New Zealand data is lovely. We're not using it. When I go to suggest we use it, we've got to do it on Australian soil, and Australia seems to be able to ignore the whole health thing connection very well. I'm not sure what's happening there, but it's not new, but it's certainly still needs to be pushed.
I've been told this better be quick. The question may be quick. I'm not sure the answers will be. This is really for Kimberly and Phillipa. We've talked so much about the houses that cannot be heated well. Could you give me some insights as to why they were initially constructed that way? Were they constructed because they were aimed at low-income people and it was minimized cost? Was it constructed because there was different standards of warmth at that time? Were they having inadequate heating systems? Because something has to have been behind that, and it'd be good to get insights as to how this actually got started.
Our pioneering free market culture, perhaps, might kind of just tell you all you need to know there. We haven't had good building standards. We haven't had good insulation standards. We haven't had a historical expectation that we could actually be warm. We haven't had a historical understanding that actually our winters here, we're not a tropical climate, you know. Yeah.
The dwelling ages, how old are they?
Helen. The dwelling age, average dwelling age in New Zealand. Okay, so 2/3 pre-insulation.
Just a very quick example about the UK. About 13% of UK houses have been built since 1991. And for instance, in Brighton, we have houses that were built in the railway workers initially, and they were built about maybe about 100 years ago as temporary houses. Now they're very, very fashionable in this one particular area in Brighton called Hanover. A lot of those houses were built with a material called bunga rouge, which is basically take any rubbish you find and make a wall with it. So that, you know, there are a lot of houses like that.
At that point, I think we have to bring our question and answer discussion to an end. It's a pity. It's been a very valuable one, but we can carry it on over drinks. Organisational matters from...